Everybody knows that morality is just herd instinct. Just like birds flying south for the winter, humans learned over time to be kind to other humans and not to steal from them. Right? My name is Steven, and welcome to My Apologies. An apology doesn't just mean saying that you're sorry. An apology could also mean giving a reason for something that you believe. For example, if I ask you why you believe that pineapple belongs on a pizza, I'm asking for an apology. Both kinds of apologies, actually, in this case. On this channel, we will examine various apologies for living a life of faith and virtue. And if I say something that offends you, well, my apologies. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to my friend Tom. I don't know if he's listening or not, but when I told him I was starting this podcast, his first response was to say, and I quote, "You should call it Dodging Stones with Steven," which I died. It's the perfect blend of dark humor, church history, and dad jokes, which is exactly my blend of humor. So if you don't get it, check out the book of Acts chapter 7, and it'll make a little more sense. But quick shout out to Tom for the best feedback I've gotten so far. I think I'm going to keep the name My Apologies, but if I need to choose a second, Dodging Stones with Steven has got to be a close second. Anyway, if you remember from episode 3 of our Mere Christianity series, which was the previous episode, we discussed the first point of the argument for God from morality. This argument can be summarized, again, as first, humans experience morality. Second, God is our best or only explanation for such morality. And third, therefore, God exists. So the first 2 points are assertions, and if they're correct, they lead to the third point, which serves as a conclusion. If it is true that humans experience morality, and that God is our best or only explanation for such morality, then it follows that humans are experiencing something which comes from God alone, and therefore it's reasonable for us to believe that God exists. If you haven't listened to the previous episode, I actually suggest pausing right now and going back and listening to that one first, because it covers the first point. If you're still here, hopefully that means that you've listened to part 1 already and you're ready for part 2. Either that or you're just really interested in hearing what I have to say about herd instinct, which is fine as well. Today we'll discuss the second point, whether or not God is our best explanation for such morality. We'll do so by exploring the 2 alternate explanations that we commonly hear and that C.S. Lewis addressed in chapter 2 of Mere Christianity. The idea is, if we can find a good alternate explanation, then the second point isn't true. If God isn't the best explanation for morality, then the whole argument falls apart. However, if these other explanations fall short, then the assertion that God is the best explanation looks like a strong argument. So these 2 alternate explanations that Lewis tackles are, 1, isn't the moral law just herd instinct? And number 2, isn't the moral law just a social convention? These are the same 2 explanations for morality that we tend to hear today, so let's get to it. The first of these alternate explanations for morality is explained by Lewis as, isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct, and hasn't it been developed just like all other instincts? He says further, we all know what it feels like to be prompted by instinct, by motherly love or sexual instinct or the instinct for food. It means that you feel a strong want or desire to act in a certain way. So, if we're talking about herd instincts, what is an instinct in the first place? Lewis explains that it is a common experience to all of us, and he says, quote, it is a strong want or desire to act in a certain way. I also found this definition helpful. It is the way people or animals naturally react or behave without having to think or learn about it. So for example, birds. Go-to example. Without having to think about it, they seem to have an instinct for certain behaviors, such as building nests for their babies or for their eggs. They don't take an architecture class or a nest building class. It seems to be this instinctual knowledge that they have. Or a better example may be flying south for the winter. They don't know how to read directions or read maps, but they instinctually know the timing and how to fly south for the winter. Humans, like me and presumably you, might have an instinct to run away when they hear a loud crashing noise. Or another example might be the motherly instinct that humans have, the instinct once you have a kid to take care of that kid. These things are all instincts. They're strong desires that we have that are not learned, but they come naturally to us. This explanation is that what we call morality is simply an instinct, And more specifically, it's a herd instinct, meaning instincts that have developed due to human beings being tribal creatures, or creatures that live in herds or societies. So the question is this true? Is morality just a herd instinct? Or is it something more than that? In some sense, I think we all have to agree that the moral law is, at the very least, it's instinctual, because of our claim from the previous episode, is that it's known by us all at an instinctual level. But Lewis is going to argue that it may be instinctual, but it's not merely an instinct. It's more. And I'll let Lewis explain because I think he does it best. He says, "Of course we sometimes do feel just that sort of desire to help another person. And no doubt that desire is due to the herd instinct. But feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help, whether you want to or not. Suppose you hear a cry for help from a man in danger. You will probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct for self-preservation. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing, which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between the two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them." So here Lewis is drawing a distinction between these desires to do something and feeling that you ought to do something. So how are these two words different, desire versus ought? I might desire to go to the store for any reason. It's just a description of a pure impulse. I could desire to go to the store to buy a new video game, which would be morally neutral, or to get groceries for an elderly woman, which would be morally positive, or I could say I desire to go to the store to buy rat poison to put in my roommate's orange juice, and that would definitely be a moral negative. The desire within me could exist for a good reason, or a bad one, or even a neutral one. It's just plain desire. But to say I ought to go to the store is something different entirely. Now I'm claiming that there is some moral reason for my desire to go to the store. To say ought is to say not only that I desire to do this or that, but that it would be the right thing for me to do. In Lewis's scenario of a man in danger, you have two competing impulses or desires. One tells you to go help the man in danger. This could be the herd instinct that we're talking about, coming from human beings as social creatures. But that second instinct is in competition with the first, and it's telling you to stay put where you are, or even to flee the situation. What are you doing, thinking about getting yourself in danger? This could be the instinct for safety, self-preservation, as he calls it, not to put oneself in harm's way. Lewis uses this example to show that we can have two or even more, potentially, instincts at once struggling within us for dominance over our actions. And if you have competing instincts, the feeling that tells you which instinct you ought to pick cannot be either of those instincts itself. The ought is what we mean when we say the moral law. So we can already see that simple herd instinct isn't a good explanation. But Lewis doesn't just stop there. We have to answer, where is that ought coming from? How will competing desires be decided between? Well, you could imagine that whichever impulse is the strongest would always win. This makes sense at first, because whenever we see conflict, the strongest side tends to win. Whether it's something physical, like a football game, or a conflict of ideas, like a debate, the strongest side tends to be victorious. So why wouldn't it be the same in ourselves between competing instincts? Well, let's look back at the example of helping a man in danger. Lewis says, if two instincts are in conflict, and there is nothing in a creature's mind except those two instincts, which would be this argument we're looking at, obviously the stronger of the two must win. But at those moments when we are most conscious of the moral law, it usually seems to be telling us to side with the weaker of the two impulses. You probably want to be safe much more than you want to help the man who is drowning, but the moral law tells you to help him all the same. And surely it often tells us to try to make the right impulse stronger than it naturally is. I mean, when we often feel it is our duty to stimulate the herd instinct by waking up our imaginations and arousing our pity, and so on, clearly we are not acting from instinct when we set about making an instinct stronger than it is. Lewis says that rather than it being the stronger of two instincts, we often experience a feeling that tells us we should awaken the weaker instinct in ourselves and choose that one over the instinct that feels stronger at that given moment. I recently experienced this in my own life. A common instinct we all have is to eat, a desire for food. It's a good instinct, nothing wrong with that. My waistline, however, has lately been telling me I need to chill it out a little bit, and so I've committed to cutting out sweets entirely from my diet. I don't know what I was thinking. It's been going well so far, but it's been definitely a challenge. Well, a few days ago, it was shortly after I first made that commitment, and I was feeling the urge. Since I was new to the whole no sweets rule that I imposed upon myself, I completely forgot about it, and I picked up my very last Happy Hippo. Now, if you don't know what a Happy Hippo is, I can't say that I blame you, but you should absolutely Google it. Not Hungry Hippos like the game, Happy Hippo. I think it's a German dessert or something, but they are absolutely my favorite. Well, after I picked it up, I remembered my rule that I shouldn't eat it. And I felt my desire for a delicious treat battling with the much weaker desire for a long-term healthier body. And what decided it was that I realized I ought to follow through with my commitments. It's the right thing to do, the moral thing to do. So I put the Happy Hippo away where it is still waiting for me until the day when my sweets fast is over. The ought compelling me was that I ought to follow through with my commitments. And because I had this, I was able to reduce my desire for a treat and increase my desire for a long-term gain, which would be a healthy body. Another example could be the movie Star Wars, the first one that was ever made, A New Hope. Now, this is a spoiler, but the movie's been out for decades, so I can't really say that I feel bad if you haven't seen it yet. You should absolutely watch it. This isn't going to ruin it for you. Near the end of the film, one of the main characters, Han Solo, leaves the rebellion against the evil empire because he has some personal business to attend to. He doesn't see the rebellion as his fight necessarily, and he really needs to pay off a debt he owes to this slug mobster named Jabba the Hutt. It's a sad moment to see Han go because he's a scoundrel, but you kind of like the character. But in the end, Han Solo changes his mind and shows up at the last minute to save the day. This is obviously celebrated by the audience as his character is deciding to do what is right instead of following his stronger desire for self-preservation. The audience all cheers exactly because he chose to do the hard thing, not because his strongest desire won out, but the opposite. This is the kind of thing Lewis means when he says in the book, "But you will find within you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing, which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away." This is exactly what Han Solo did, and it resonates as heroism within all of us. So when we have multiple competing desires within us, it's not just the strongest that wins. But is there another option? How else, other than a moral law, could we decide between impulses? Well, Lewis is going to provide one more option for us to look at. Maybe morality isn't just the herd instinct, but maybe morality is a set of instincts. Maybe there are some good instincts and some bad instincts, and we choose the good over the bad. He writes, "If the moral law was one of our instincts, we ought to be able to point to some impulse inside us which was always what we call good, always in agreement with right behavior. But you cannot. There is none of our impulses which the moral law may not sometimes tell us to suppress, and none of which it may not sometimes tell us to encourage." And he gives a few examples of this, so I'll summarize the next section. Surely it's the case that more often than not, the instinct to fight should be suppressed, and the instinct to love one's children should be encouraged. But this does not mean either of them is wholly bad or wholly good all the time. And this would be what you would expect if morality was just contained within these instincts themselves. So for example, the instinct to fight. It should be restrained if one is insulted, if you're insulted at a bar, or if you are in a heated disagreement during a football game with someone from the other team. But we could probably think of situations in which we shouldn't restrain our impulse to fight. For example, there was a video that went viral a few years ago, or maybe a year or two ago, in which a man in Utah, I think, was on a hike and he found himself being stalked by a mountain lion. Now, if this is you, suddenly that fight instinct is something you're no longer trying to repress. You want to wake up that instinct to fight. Or maybe if someone breaks into your home, the desire to fight becomes suddenly a good thing, the desire to protect your family and your home. So we can see how this generally negative instinct that needs to be suppressed may need to be awakened during some specific moments. On the other side, even the motherly love of one's children is not absolutely good. For the average man or woman, to love one's children is the obvious thing we should do. The role of a parent is to sacrifice some of your own comfort and to desire what's best for your children. You want to set them up for success. But what if we're talking about the mother of a serial killer? Shouldn't she put away her motherly love in favor of perhaps love of neighbor or love of society, love of justice, and turn her son into the police? And this leads us to a quote from the book, which I find absolutely fascinating. Lewis writes, "The most dangerous thing you can do is take any one impulse from your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. You might think love of humanity in general was safe, but it is not. If you leave out justice, you will find yourself breaking agreements and faking evidence in trials for the sake of humanity, quote unquote, and become, in the end, a cruel and treacherous man. This part blew my mind a little bit. I absolutely loved it. The idea that if you make one impulse the ultimate good, you will end up, in the end, being a tyrant. Lewis uses this example of love of humanity and how it could lead you to committing all sorts of injustice for the sake of this love. My mind goes to famous supervillains, maybe from James Bond or Thanos from the Avengers movies. They often claim to have the greater good in mind, but their greater good is the pursuit of a single impulse that they have set above the others, like justice or mercy, etc. And for that reason, they end up becoming the bad guy, the evil that needs to be defeated. The final thing to say about this is an analogy Lewis uses, and I think it wraps up the instincts conversation quite nicely. Of all the things he says in this section, the analogy of a piano helped me personally understand this the most. Lewis writes, "Strictly speaking, there are no such things as good or bad impulses. Think of a piano. It has not got two kinds of notes on it, the right notes and the wrong notes. Every single note is right at one time and wrong in another. The moral law is not any one instinct or set of instincts. It is something which makes a kind of tune. The tune we call goodness or right conduct, and it does this by directing the instincts. So if the instincts are the keys on a piano, the moral law is the sheet music by which we are led to play the notes or the instincts at the right time and place. The sheet music directs the keys. The moral law directs the instincts." So that covers the argument that the moral law is really just herd instinct. The conclusion is that morality cannot be contained in the instincts themselves. It must be something outside of our instincts that is directing us, helping us choose what instinct to agree with in the right moment. Now we're on to the second explanation that I mentioned at the beginning, and that is to say, isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that is put into us by education? And in order to answer this explanation, we need to first draw a distinction between the types of ways education can work. There are some things that we do learn that are merely social convention, rules of behavior that are imposed on us by society alone, and they can differ from society to society. This would be things such as how we dress, proper manners like not chewing with your mouth open, which is a personal pet peeve of mine. Or a good one in the book that I really like is to say, what side of the road do we drive on? This is a social convention. And you can tell because in the UK and a few other countries, they drive on the left side of the road, while in most of the world, like the US where I live, we drive on the right side of the road. I actually got to experience driving on the opposite side of the road whenever I took a trip to South Africa, and it was an absolute trip. It was wild. Such a weird feeling to get used to. And the reason it was so strange was exactly because I had been socially conditioned. I had been taught to do it a different way. It felt unnatural to me because of my education. So these sorts of things are examples of the category of education that we can rightly call social convention. And that's what this argument claims the moral law is. There are other things that we learn, though, that do not fall into this category. The best example of this would be mathematics. Math is not something that is decided upon by society. It's not decided upon any more than we could decide that fire is hot. It just is. Math is absolute. It's an objective truth, something that we discover. We discover math. We don't create math. To demonstrate this, I challenge you. Get out a pencil and a pad of paper or get out your laptop and try to come up with a mathematics system that differs from our own in a way other than just by changing the definitions of words. What I mean by that is, for example, you could say, you may have heard it said that 2 + 2 = 5, but it's simply not true. You're only changing what the words mean. To put it tangibly, if I had 2 cherries in my hand, and you give me 2 more cherries, it is not possible that an extra cherry, a 5th cherry, would appear in my hand. If you're saying 2 cherries + 2 cherries = 5, you must have just changed the meaning of the word 5 to mean 4 items. This is because math is linked to physical, tangible reality. This is no different than to say 2 + 2 = cuatro. That's my terrible Spanish accent. And to say that and pretend that you've now created a new math system. You haven't. You just switched around a definition. Another interesting attempt I saw in my research was someone who was arguing 2 + 2 could equal 22. And this I thought was super interesting. I hadn't heard this one before. But again, as I read into it, I realized they're just changing the meanings of words. What they were basically doing was just math with Roman numerals, in which, for example, I plus I equals II, which is to say 1 plus 1 equals 2. Or I plus V equals IV. Or maybe it's VI. I haven't done Roman numerals in a while. But anyway, the math itself hasn't changed. They're just playing around with what the symbols and words mean. Math is a real truth that can't be created. It can only be discovered. So with these two types of education, we have social convention and real truths. How can we tell which one applies to the moral law? Is it mere social convention like the argument suggests? Well, there are two ways Lewis gives us that we can tell moral law is more like math than it is like driving on the wrong side of the road. Reason number one is because of the universal experience of the moral law, the fact that all cultures at all times have had very little difference in their experience of morality. And I'm not going to say much about this one because this was the literal point of episode 3. We covered it in the previous episode. I will add, however, that Lewis created an extensive list of evidence of these similarities in the appendix of one of his other books, which is called The Abolition of Man. If you find yourself doubting that all these cultures were actually so similar morally, it's a list I would really suggest looking at. Again, that's in the book The Abolition of Man in the appendix. As I was reading through it, one section that was particularly striking to me, he was quoting a series of laws from all these different cultures regarding showing mercy to others. So this isn't about like justice or stealing. It's about something as abstract as showing mercy. And he had examples from ancient India, Babylon, the Old Norse culture, Romans, Jews, and even the Australian Aborigines. Now that is a shocking degree of universality. That's across all of these continents over most of the known world at the time. They all had the same idea of showing mercy as being something part of the moral law. Just super interesting to me. Definitely suggest checking that out. On to reason number 2, which is the fact that we all believe in progress. Progress, as Lewis says in this section, means not just changing, but changing for the better. If no set of moral ideas was truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality. In fact, of course, we all do believe that some moralities are better than others. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understand morality better than their neighbors did. Very well then. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are, in fact, measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either of them. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. So if you've ever desired that your society would progress towards something better, you have acknowledged this fact. Some societies can be better than others. Or maybe you would see where we are in the modern era, and you would compare it with the brutality of the Middle Ages. To compare the two and judge one to be more moral than the other is to implicitly agree that morality exists in that category of real truth, like mathematics. It's not just a social convention, it's real. This is because you are comparing the two against some real standard and determining which is more like that standard. Lewis continues by explaining what he means by real truth, and he does this by describing New York City as an analogy. He says, the reason why your idea of New York can be truer or less true than mine is that New York is a real place, existing quite apart from what either of us thinks. If when each of us said New York, each means just the town I am imagining in my own head, how could one of us have a truer idea than the other? In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nation had ever been more correct, no sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse. Now, I never lived in New York, nor do I know very much about the city other than what you can see on TV. So I'll use my own example of Salt Lake City, a place where I lived for about 5 years. If I say that Salt Lake City is at the foot of the mountains and it's near the shores of the Great Salt Lake, I would be accurately describing the city. But if my friend from the introduction, Tom, added, yeah, and it has hundreds of skyscrapers, just like New York or LA, well, I would look at him like he's crazy, and I'd say, you're wrong. And this is because we're both describing a real place, Salt Lake City. If by saying Salt Lake City, we just meant whatever city we were imagining at the moment, whatever imaginary city is in our head, I couldn't say Tom was wrong. After all, he's just describing what's in his imagination. But as soon as we agree that we're describing a real city, we introduce the possibility that one of us could be objectively wrong. Similarly, if we're saying that our society is better than Nazi society, to use Lewis's example, remember he lived through the Second World War, so Nazism was fresh on the mind. If our society is better than the Nazis, in order for that to be true, we must be comparing it by some objective standard, a real moral society, like the true moral society, and comparing which of these societies, ours or Nazism, is closest to that one. If morality is just social convention, there's no sense in saying that one society is better than the other. They're both equally good based on their own separate social conventions. So because morality has been universally experienced, reason number one, and because we all believe in this idea of progress, reason number two, the moral law must be in the category of a real truth rather than just a social convention. So to recap what we've talked about, there were two main explanations for morality other than God. The first was morality, as we call it, comes from herd instinct that we've developed as a species, not from a God. The second was that morality comes from social convention. That is to say, it was taught to us by other humans, and it's just convention, like driving on the right or left side of the road. What Lewis has shown is that these two most common counter-explanations for what we are calling the moral law, they're not very good options at all. They fall short, and therefore, the idea of a moral law given by God seems to be the strongest available option. We could end it here, but before we close, I'd like to examine just a little bit further the worldview that would come from those who would deny the moral law and subscribe to either of the views we discussed today. I've pulled a quote from an excellent article on William Lane Craig's website on the very topic of the moral argument. I'll have a link in the show notes to it. He writes, Richard Taylor, who is a prominent non-Christian ethicist, invites us to imagine a race of people who are living in a state of nature without any laws or customs. He says, let's suppose one of them kills another and takes his goods. This would have no more moral significance than if one animal killed another and took something that the other animal had. He gives the illustration of a lion killing a zebra and says, a lion kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder it technically. Murder is a human value judgment. A lion kills a zebra, but the lion isn't guilty of murder. A seagull may snatch a fish from the talons of another seagull, but it doesn't steal the fish. Stealing is a moral term that is the product of human thinking. It takes the fish, but it doesn't steal it. So look at the world through the view of someone who believes that morality is merely a social convention. As William Lane Craig points out, this would mean that objective morality does not exist. There is no actual right or wrong, no true New York, like Lewis would say. No standard that we can appeal to, and nothing to hold us accountable. All actions that we could do would just be a matter of convenience. We could change what is moral for society just by getting 51% of people to change their mind and agree that it's moral. Majority rules. Anything could be made to be moral. And what a terrifying world that would be. A person in that world could never think to themselves, what is the right act for me to take in this situation? What would justice look like? They might think that, but they would just be fooling themselves. No true right action exists for them to discover, only that which is most convenient to the individual. If one decided to act selflessly, like for example to give money to the poor, it would be no morally better than to steal or kill someone. Now, you may be thinking this is a little bit extreme, but truly, I think we give too much credit to a worldview that denies a moral law. To be fair and charitable, I don't think that most people who believe it's only a social convention or herd instinct, I don't think that they want to do away with the moral law entirely. They just want to probably do away with minor portions that inconvenience them at the time. Your average person, very likely, they don't want to murder and steal or do anything else extreme. They only want to be left alone to act against the moral law in small ways. White lies, petty theft, maybe a little bit of sexual promiscuity. They're just trying to get ahead in this world and have a little bit of rebellious fun while they're at it. Now, admittedly, that seems much less severe than what I was describing earlier and what William Lane Craig pointed out. But the concern is this. If you do away with the moral law, you do away with all of it. If morality is not objectively real, then it is objectively false, regardless of your intentions. A life without morality is not better. It's far, far worse. Thankfully, though, we do have a moral law. In episodes 3 and 4 of this podcast, we have examined the first 2 chapters of Mere Christianity, as well as the argument for God from morality. Episode 3 covered point 1, the common experience of human morality. And this episode has looked at point 2 by answering the question, isn't morality just herd instinct or social convention? Even though Mere Christianity is over 70 years old, this argument is timeless. It was used long before Lewis, and it's still being used today by apologists as prominent as William Lane Craig. I hope that this overview was helpful for you, and if you know anyone who could benefit from it, please share it with them. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the like button and subscribe. I post every week, so if you want to be notified when I post a new video, ring the little bell to turn on notifications. Until next time, my name is Stephen Cram, and this has been My Apologies.